Okay, now that we've discussed anxiety disorders, we're going to go ahead and move on to mood or affective disorders, which are also a very typical mental health issue that people can face. When I'm talking about mood disorders or affective disorders, really I'm talking about two primary mental health issues. A mood disorder is a condition in which a person experiences extremes in moods. There are two main types of affective disorders and mood disorders. Depressive disorders, which include major depression or major depressive disorder, and dysthymic disorder. We're going to spend some time talking about both of these, and then we're going to go ahead and link major depression back to suicide. The other primary type of mood disorder are bipolar disorders, and we're going to spend a few minutes in this lecture talking about bipolar 1 versus bipolar 2 disorders. So how typical or how common are mood disorders or depression? We know depression affects about 17% of the population in North America and Europe. One way of thinking about this is imagining that about 1 in 5 people is impacted by depression or will experience depression at some point in their lives. The World Health Organization estimates that if this trend continues, it will become the second most disabling disease in our nation. Usually depression is chronic. When I use that term chronic, what I'm talking about is that once a person experiences depression, they will be struggling with that off and on for the remainder of their lives. But about a third will have one episode of depression, and that will be it. Typical times in human development that we see depression includes late adolescence and early adulthood. So one of the things that people who work in high schools and in colleges and university settings have come to recognize is that this is a particularly challenging time period where we see a lot of mental health issues emerge, particularly around depression. It seems as if once a student gets to 17, 18, 19, they are particularly vulnerable to the stressors of life and have a higher propensity to develop depression. The second time in human development that we see this mental health issue peak out is in late adulthood. And when I talk about late adulthood as a developmental time period, I'm really talking about people that are over the age of 70, people that we would consider elderly. They have a tendency or a propensity to struggle with depression during that time period. We see a high level of comorbidity between depression and other mental health issues. Remember, when I use that term comorbidity, what I'm talking about is that depression has a tendency to appear with other mental health issues or to happen at the same time as other mental health issues. We see a lot of comorbidity between depression and PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression and also obsessive compulsive disorder, between depression and substance abuse disorders, such as abusing alcohol and abusing drugs. Some gender differences that we do see: women are diagnosed with depression 2 to 3 times more often than men are. We have some different theories or some different ideas as to why this may be. One theory is that women are diagnosed more often with depression simply because they report more often. They are more likely to talk to a physician, more likely to seek out counseling services in comparison to men, because from a gendered perspective, men have been taught that they need to resolve their own problems or to ignore any emotional weakness that they might have. So it's not as if they're not experiencing depression, but rather they just don't want to report it. Another theory focuses in on some of the symptoms that we have attributed to depression. And the argument has been that it's not that men are not experiencing depression, but rather that it symptomizes or that it shows itself in a different way. So while women feel sad, while women cry, men are more apt to get angry or to lash out. And this is not often coded or seen as depression, but in fact it is. Another theory looks at hormones, focusing in on the differences between estrogen and testosterone, that women, because of their hormonal cycles, have a higher propensity or are more predisposed towards depression. The last possible explanation that I'm going to focus in on is this the fact that women have children and they are more likely to experience postpartum depression. So I want to spend a couple minutes here talking about postpartum depression. This is the depressed state that one experiences after having a baby. A lot of women will talk about this as the baby blues. So usually what will happen is that after a woman has a baby, her hormones sort of crash and they get very sad. What often goes hand in hand with this is right after a baby's born, you're not doing a lot of sleeping because they're waking you up every couple of hours. And so women experience a real sense of sadness after a baby is born, when it should be a time where they feel their happiest. And then usually for many women that we use this term baby blues, after a couple weeks it starts to get better, their hormones start to gear back up again, they get back into a little bit of a sleep schedule, and they start to feel better. The concern really happens if women don't gear up and they don't start to feel better after a couple weeks. That's when the people around her need to start to get concerned and need to be observant because this can spiral into a severe depression. So we're going to move now into some of the major types of mood disorders, one of them being major depressive disorder, or MDD. This is characterized by at least 2 weeks of depressed mood or loss of interest in all activities. The individual generally feels sad and hopeless. Some of the symptoms that you're going to see are going to include things like loss of energy, a lot of eating and sleep disturbances. So one of the things that we see is that a person may be continuously overeating, or they may experience a total loss of appetite. Sleep disturbances, they always seem tired but can't ever seem to fall asleep, or they have trouble falling asleep, or they may be waking up periodically throughout the night. They'll have problems working, they'll have problems concentrating, and they really take very little pleasure in anything. They really don't enjoy any sort of activity anymore. Family members, their job, their friends, their hobbies, nothing makes them happy. Dysthymia is a less intense but longer lasting form of depression. So if we think of major depressive disorder as being a much more severe or serious or deeper depression, dysthymia is a sense of feeling sad and feeling joyless, but doesn't have the deeper depressed mood that MDD does. When we think about suicide, one of the things is that really sort of separates MDD from dysthymia is that we rarely see people who have dysthymia commit suicide or contemplate suicide. They're just very sad and very despondent. Some statistics on suicide: in 2009, about 36,000 people committed suicide. This makes it the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. Suicide rates do vary with age, gender, and ethnicity. A lot of people are very surprised by this, but it is the most common among those over 65, especially males. We often think or connect suicide to teenagers or young adults, but in fact, it is the most common among people who are in later life stages. It is the third leading cause of death in 15 to 24-year-olds and the second leading cause of death in college students. We do know that women attempt suicide more often than men do. This isn't very surprising since more women are diagnosed with depression. However, men are more likely to succeed. And the reason for that is because men have a tendency to attempt more violent means of suicide in comparison to women. Rates of suicide in terms of ethnicity from highest to lowest. The highest rates are among American Indians, and then European Americans, white Americans, Asians, Hispanics, and finally African Americans. The thing about suicide is that it's often very difficult to predict who's going to commit suicide. Suicidal ideation is not uncommon. About 3% of all adults will report that at some point in their lives they've had suicidal thoughts in the past year. About 10% of college students report having suicidal thoughts in the past year. So it can become very difficult to sort of tease apart or understand what it's going to take for a person to actually commit suicide. A couple things to keep in mind is that if a person is talking about suicide, even just talking about it, they're more likely to attempt it. There is a difference between thinking about it and then letting it go, and then actually actively talking about it. The next thing to keep in mind is that when a person struggles with MDD, major depressive disorder, and they are starting treatment, it is most important at that point to keep your eyes on them and keep a lookout for them. One of the things that's very interesting is that when a person starts to take antidepressants and they just start to feel better, they start to feel more energetic, that's when they're most likely to attempt suicide. They still have the thoughts, they still have the negative thoughts, they still have the depression, but now they have the energy, whereas before they did not. We're going to move on now and talk a little bit about bipolar, also known as manic depressive. It's a mood disorder where a person alternates between mania and depression. Bipolar disorder affects about 1%, 1 to 2% of the population, and there are two main types. There's bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. The biggest difference between them is that in bipolar 2 you have hypomania. It's just, you still have the depressive periods, but the manic phases are less severe. It's as if they're lopped off. They're there, but they're not as extreme as you would see in bipolar 1. Mania, it's a period of at least 1 week during which an elated emotional state persists. The person feels great, they talk incessantly, they talk about all the things that they're going to do. They often sleep very little. They're very active, almost hyperactive. And because they are not sleeping and they will go for long periods of time without sleeping, their mania may develop into delusions, which are false beliefs. So they're talking about things that they're doing, or they have a set of beliefs that just don't seem sensible and just don't seem reasonable. One example of this, a good friend of mine, her son is bipolar, and in one manic state he thought that he could not be hurt and went and took a walk across a busy street, and a car ran into him and broke his leg. The very typical sort of belief that they may have, or delusion that they may have. So when we think about causes of mood disorders, where do we look? Well, because of the increasing biological tendency in psychology to look for these sort of biological explanations, there's been quite a bit of research done that tries to find an underlying biological basis for mood disorders. When we look at twin studies, when we look at the genetics, and remember, twin studies, those are those studies that were done of identical twins that are separated at birth. We find that a co-twin is 4 times more likely to experience depression if the other twin experiences it. So we see this with both MDD, and we also see this with bipolar. We see that it runs in twins, and we even see a relationship if family members are closely enough related. So, for example, if a parent experiences depression or bipolar, their child is more likely to experience depression or be bipolar. So the belief here is that there's probably some sort of genetic underlying cause. So what's going on? It may be imbalances in the brain's neurotransmitters. A lot of research has focused in on norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine, particularly serotonin. Gene 13 has been connected to the operation of serotonin, so there might be something genetically going on with this particular gene that's being passed along, and it's impacting serotonin levels. Another theory that looks at neurotransmitter levels is the human biome. So this is the bacteria that lives in the gut. We now have come to realize that this biome that resides in the human digestive system is responsible for about 70 to 85% of serotonin production. And if that bacteria is thrown off kilter, either by the use of extensive antibiotics or because the person isn't eating a diet that's healthy or varied, fruits and vegetables, those sorts of things, that can impact their biome and ultimately impact their physical health and also their mental health. Other biological systems that we look at include the endocrine system. Remember, the endocrine system are your hormones. So we've already talked a little bit about this, and maybe it might explain some of the differences that we see between men and women. One of the other things that we know is that people that struggle with depression, about 70% of them produce high levels of cortisol. What is challenging with looking at cortisol as an explanation is that we know the body produces cortisol when it's under stress. So we don't know if the depression is causing stress, and that's causing the increase in cortisol, or if the increase of cortisol is what's causing the depression. Structural abnormalities of the brain. One of the things that we have done, research has done, is looked at the relationship between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. If we see a suppressed development in the prefrontal cortex and an overactive amygdala, this person seems to be predisposed to depression. Remember, the amygdala is the seat of anger and strong emotions, where your prefrontal cortex is supposed to mediate those emotions and help you to think logically. If the prefrontal cortex is suppressed and isn't working properly and the amygdala is overactive, it can set you up for a mood disorder. Biological rhythms. This is also something that research has been looking at the body's internal clock. So one of the things that we have found, research has found, is that people during particular seasons have a tendency to become depressed. So people that live in areas that get cold during the winter time, they experience what is called seasonal affective disorder. And the thinking here is that the lack of sunlight and lack of exposure to sun is somehow keeping that person from absorbing vitamin D, making them sleep longer, sort of throwing off their biological rhythm and setting them on a cycle toward depression. Some of the ways that this gets addressed is there are special lights that can be bought that a person can sit in front of, say 15, 20 minutes a day, to help keep their internal clock going. Another thing is to just take a short vacation, 3-4 days, go down to a warm part of the country and sit in the sun. That also seems to work. When we think of psychological causes of mood disorders, there's a couple different theories that we have. We've talked a little bit about Freud already in this class, and Freud really believed that depression was the result of unconscious processes. In other words, there's a conflict between the id and the superego. The ego is simply not strong enough to manage that relationship, so the person becomes predisposed to depression. Rogers, who we connect to humanism, felt that depression was a result of a space between the ideal self and the real self. In other words, who that person was and who that person wanted to be. And the way to prevent depression was to bring those two together. In other words, to accept yourself for who you are. A lot of research now on psychological causes of mood disorder really focuses in on environmental stressors. So are there things that are going on in the environment that might contribute to a person developing a mood disorder? A lot of research now on epigenetics that looks at biological predispositions and then factors in the environment that trip those genes off and can cause a person to develop depression. So when I use that term environmental stressors, I'm really talking about things like job loss, poverty, divorce, loss of a loved one, those sorts of things, isolation, anything that might cause stress in a person's life. Psychological theories also argue that the way people think about stressors is very important. Because stress is going to happen. Stress happens to everyone, but not everyone develops depression. Well, why is this? So Beck has proposed a cognitive theory of depression where Aaron Beck really makes a very persuasive argument in saying that it isn't the stressors in and of themselves, but rather the way that a person reacts to and relates to those stressors and how they think about those stressors. Are they prone to things like learned helplessness? In other words, it doesn't matter what I do. I have no impact on my environment. Things are the way they are. I don't have any control. Do they have a negative attributional style? Do they always see the negative side of things? Do they engage in a pattern of self-blame? Aaron Beck, his theory of cognitive restructuring has been very, very effective, a very effective therapeutic approach to helping treat depression. The last thing I want to talk about is this idea of rumination or being ruminative. This is the work of Susan Nolan Hoeksema, and one of the things that she proposes, which has been very, very powerful in terms of ways that we've come to conceptualize how people develop depression, is this idea that some people are predisposed to ruminate, particularly women. They are predisposed to ruminate. Well, what ruminate means is that you think about the same things over and over and over and over again. So what Susan Nolan Hoeksema proposed was that something happens in the environment. You experience divorce, or you break up with a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or you have a job loss, or you're having some sort of problem in the environment, and you start to think about it, and you think about it, and you think about it, and you think about it over and over and over again. And what happens is that when you go to sleep, instead of sleeping, what you're really doing is you're ruminating, and you're thinking about the same things. And so you're not sleeping. And what starts to happen is this cycle of thinking and a lack of sleep and thinking about the same things over and over again and then a lack of sleep, and it starts to spiral you into depression. And the belief here is that if you can help a person come to accept things the way that they are and stop thinking about the same things over and over again, it stops the cycle of rumination.